Welcome to this New Thinking for a New World podcast of the Wallenberg Foundation. Does COVID have a silver lining for Europe? Closed borders, hoarded medical equipment, confused policies, fractious summits. By any measure, the pandemic has not been the EU's finest hour. But could it have been bad enough that Europe's leaders now know they must do better? Is it possible that failure in the face of COVID could produce a more successful European future? Palacio, Spain's former foreign minister and a leading European legal and foreign affairs scholar, and Magnus Schöldtz, former Swedish ambassador and advisor to the Wallenberg Foundations, talk about Europe's challenges with Alan Stoga.
Arguably, the pandemic has not been the EU's finest moment. Closed borders, trade restrictions, nasty summits. Europe's political leaders, but also a lot of European citizens' first instincts seem to have been to look to local or national solutions rather than to European solutions. We'll get to the recovery fund, the budget, the future in a moment, but I'd like to start with the COVID crisis. What is it about the last months that has made it so hard for Europe to be Europe? Anna, what do you think?
Well, first of all, you say that COVID hasn't been the finest hour, but it hasn't been the finest hour for anyone, except maybe for New Zealand or South Korea. So that's the first thing that we have to bear in mind. My second comment at this stage would be that, the European Union is messy. It has always been messy, and this is part of the character. And I would say that the worst was when we saw the internal market, the four freedoms disappear. From one day to the next, borders were closed. There was that each man for himself. Just if I had a mask, I wouldn't share it. There were shipments that were stopped in the internal market. And this was hard. And I think that this is something to take into account. And in that sense, it was dangerous. But this was then reframed, rephrased. And again, the story goes on and the story continues. And there are fine moments, as you mentioned, nasty summits. But in the end, there was an agreement, not just on the 7 years budget of the European Union, but also on this annex of funding that is not just credit, it's also just very concessional. It's non-repayable. And I think that this is a major issue.
I want to come back to the recovery fund in a moment, but Magnus, first thoughts.
Well, I do agree with you and Anna that this was not the finest hour. And while one should remember that healthcare is a national prerogative, as we know, even a subnational, that is regional responsibility. So actually national coordination of these issues is also a challenge. So of course, consequently, European coordination on these issues is a huge undertaking and has not been the mandate. So I think that is worth remembering. And I agree with Anna. Sadly enough, some very national protectionistic instincts kicked in, and the panic surrounding the storage or availability of critical equipment and safety equipment and all sense went out of the room with regards to the principles of the single market and supply chains. And that was the worst moment, I would say. And again, we'll get back to what has happened. I think Europe has this strange tradition of developing through crises, and this is a crisis that we cannot waste in the sense that there are a number of instruments that we should put in place so that next time around we will do it very differently.
Again, leaving aside the details of the budget and the recovery fund for a minute, you implicitly are making the case that having had the bad reaction at the start could be a learning moment for Europe, could produce both at the leadership level as well as at the citizenship level, a different reaction going forward. Is that a fair way to look at it, that if a crisis occurred again today or tomorrow, that the reaction this time might be better? Or am I being too optimistic?
Well, this crisis of the COVID, as all the crises, has not just signaled the fault lines, but has aggrandized the fault lines. It has just brought differences into the system. And there are good news, and the budget and the fund are good news. We will react better because we will know. And I hope that we take advantage of this knowledge. One of the problems of this crisis is that nobody saw it coming. Nobody. But having said that, I don't think that we are close to seeing, for instance, the health competencies just going to Brussels. So the European Commission having bigger competencies on there. Magnus has very ably and diplomatically, which is very normal, used coordination. But coordination is not the essence. The essence of the internal market is share sovereignty, share competences. Just having the European Union institutions, and in particular the European Commission and the European Parliament deciding. I'm not sure that we are going to see transfers of sovereignty anytime soon. But yes, we will react in a more intelligent way. Yes, this for sure, because we will learn. In Europe, we learn from our mistakes.
You mentioned the fault lines. There's obviously fault lines running north-south, mostly over economics, east-west, over social policy, judicial policy, the role of the state. How fundamental are those fissures to the future of the European Union? Magnus?
Well, of course, this summer the north-south divide maybe was brought, to the front pages. But I think one should take a step back in looking at it. Of course, we had a financial crisis before, and the measures taken and the lessons learned in that very dire situation, a life and death situation for the euro as a currency. Unprecedented mechanisms, systems were put in place in order to steer all member states, I would say, into more fiscally prudent waters. And of course, you had varying responses from those countries that had the most severe problems, many of them in the south. But I would say all, Greece, of course, as the most prominent example, but including Anna's home country and Portugal and others, made significant reforms in order to respond to these challenges, and showed the responsibility that we would expect here up north, because for our own historical reasons, we have put those mechanisms in place in our national systems and already prior to this financial crisis. So, and of course, you also had there, which is significant, I think, the ECB and the famous Draghi, whatever it takes, actually doing a lot of the spending in order to underpin those reform efforts while they were happening. So I think that's the backdrop against which we saw this kind of the debate this summer on the recovery fund. Of course, significant is what happened when Germany and Angela Merkel decided that they would accept common borrowing. But again, I think one should remember this is for specific reasons and in response to corona-related effects, and whether it's and of course it's on a gigantic scale, never heard of. But it's still not known whether this will be an exception or a precedent for how the EU would handle this. And of course, I think eventually the frugal four, as we were called, we were actually five because Finland was pretty much part of the group as well, came to a sensible compromise. And I would not even though it took 4 days and nights before an agreement was reached, I think at the end of the day, there was an agreement, there was a common will, and I think that's what should be remembered out of these discussions. But it's historical, the Hamiltonian moment, maybe not, but still the something worth discussing for 4 days at the highest level.
So the process, as you've both said, produced a good outcome, or at least produced an historic outcome. Anna, how do you think about that? Whether it's a Hamiltonian moment or not, how do you think about the consequences? What is the implication of both the conversation, those 4 days and nights, but also the output, the recovery fund and the budget?
Well, I hope that there is a better understanding about what the European construction is about. I think that Magnus has very rightly underlined a term, which is responsibility. I would underline another term, interest. Again, this was about the internal market. Without this fund, which has been introduced as exceptional. I mean, for the moment, nobody thinks that this will be a routine for the European Union. This is why it is important that the Eurobond solution that would have been a kind of a series or something to be more evidently repeated is out of the picture. Here we have a fund linked to a 7-year budget and with a character of exceptionality. So let's again go to this idea, responsibility. Absolutely, yes. And this is something that in the South, we need to understand that solidarity is not the name of the game today. It's not solidarity, it's about interest, but it's about interest with responsibility. And in the North, I think that the frugals have to understand what does it imply in terms of the efforts that Magnus highlighted that the South has made, the efforts on just getting better in terms of, in macroeconomic terms, and the reforms were harsh. They were conducted in all, in the member states of the spendthrifts of the South, they were conducted. We also have to understand that this interest is an interest that is not, it's not short term. It has to be an interest in the long term. And in the long term, this interest and this responsibility is what adds up to this solidarity, because we are in it together. So we need to educate our public opinion in Spain and to tell them, no, you cannot say, oh, solidarity. It doesn't work like this. You have to understand that we have a common interest, and that this common interest, we need to have this responsibility, which is also a responsibility of the North to understand the differences which are there. But again, we are in together. Unless we part, we are bound, and this bound is called solidarity.
So solidarity, interests, and responsibility as a package.
Yeah.
And let me add to that we, from the business side in Sweden at least, we reminded the Swedish government that it is in our interest to make sure that the markets in Southern Europe and all over Europe would continue to function, so that we did not see a crunch in demand that would then hit our industries, because the economies were going down there. And that is, I think we have a similar pedagogic challenge up here in North to explain for our citizens, our taxpayers, that this is the dependency of the European economies, if we look only at the European level of things. So I think it takes a lot of leadership here. And of course, it's both in the direct handling of the COVID crisis and in the economic consequences, sometimes it's too easy for the politicians just to blame the European level or blame the system, the European cooperation for what's happening, instead of explain and use the platform for the interest to the interest of the citizens.
And let me just summarize this idea that the European project has suffered and suffers from structural blame game from the member states, and this we have to come to terms as well on this, because our public opinions many times are misled by this kind of schizophrenia of the government, and this is part of this learning curve that I hope that we have understood.
This was a set of decisions that excluded, for the first time in decades, the United Kingdom. Brexit is underway. Perhaps a hard Brexit is in sight. But the question I'd like to ask is this. Putting aside the details, what do you think are the lasting consequences of the UK having left the EU?
Of course, the critical mass of the European Union in the world has nothing to do without the UK. And this is particularly true in international relations and defense. And it was just a few days ago that the Minister of Defense of Germany just highlighted that we could not plan our defense without the UK. Well, it's going to be complicated, but the European Union has to have a personality. Having said that, what's the worst about the Brexit is that for the first time, we see that the project is not irreversible. Now we have come to terms with reality. So I think that this idea that this is not irreversible is something that I hope will permeate in positive grounds by having a European Union that in the future will be Schengen approach, will be different configurations, because this is what is the first consequence of the Brexit, is that this idea of la méthode communautaire and everybody just going at the same path doesn't. It's not just any longer part of the reality of the system. And as I say, what I hope is that we will channel this situation through constructing more Euros, more Schengen, where some member states participate and others do not.
Magnus, a two-track Europe?
Yes, I mean, Sweden is an example of that already, having had a referendum on the euro, and we said no, which is, if you ask the people in Brussels, they still consider us to be pre-ins in a technical, in a judicial way, which is true. They are just waiting for us to join. Of course, the political reality in Sweden is that maybe one political party having maybe 4% of the electorate would openly argue for a euro membership. And I mean, that flexible approach is already there. So it's a multiple speed. Of course, you need to have a common platform within the European Union. Otherwise, it would be too flexible. And of course, the single market and legalities surrounding that must be at the core of that. And for instance, the common trade policy that we have. So otherwise, things would definitely go apart. I mean, it was the saddest moment in my professional life with the referendum and the results and what we have experienced since then. It's really not least for a country like Sweden, who has used actually the UK as its to leverage our positions within the European Union, and now we miss them, and hence also you saw the Frugal Four having to step to the fore to make its case heard. I think had the Brits been in the room, it would have been a different kind of dynamic in those discussions. So we miss them as like-minded, if you put it like that. But it's a bit too early. We are in the midst of waiting for the Brits to give us exactly how they want to handle the permanent agreement or permanent relationship with the European Union going forward. And I'm still hopeful that it will not be a limited approach. I fear it will be. But both how they handle the coming weeks and months, actually, and what we end up with as a more permanent agreement is still deciding whether this will be a happy relationship or one that is, going to be hurting us more than benefiting us.
Do you think there'll be a hard Brexit January 1st, Anna?
I think at least it will not be a harmonious Brexit. This is there. This is as far as we can say today. I'm an optimist, and I always think that there is a possibility that it's not a completely hard Brexit, by which I mean an aggressive, confrontational Brexit. In between harmonious Brexit, which is not going to happen, and a confrontational Brexit where we will, I hope it doesn't happen. There are all kind of grays, and there again, we have the COVID as backdrop, and we have the elections of the United States as backdrop, and it will depend a lot on how, for instance, these two events, or this process of COVID and this election in the United States and the aftermath, this will be taken into account in the aggressiveness of this. But if we are reasonable, and I hope that we don't want suicide as Western, as citizens of the West, we don't want to suicide. I think that there will be, some common grounds. I mentioned the intervention of the defense, the German defense minister. Of course, if we have a Schengen in defense, we have to have the UK participating in it, and it will be the interest of the UK as well. But of course, if it's a very sour divorce, maybe it will take some time to go over. It's divorces are always terrible. Rarely just agree. And we are in a kind of very difficult, unforeseen divorce, because I don't think that those that voted for Brexit understood well the consequences that this will bring for the UK. And those in the continent, and there were some that said, okay, well, now we can be together and we can do more things together and we will have more commonalities, are also wrong. And allow me one detail, because it's not a detail. Magnus has highlighted this UK approach, and I will take it at a very low level, at the level of the legislation. The legislation, the UK voice was always a voice that you should take into account, because it was common sense, it was practical. It would bring people, opposite positions to a reasonable kind of wishy-washy, but reasonable and workable solution. And Magnus, you will miss them because they were the ones that would take the front line in just putting on the table positions that you would defend from a more, I would say, from the trenches. But even for a country like Spain, the voice of the UK will be missed, and it will be missed among many other areas because of the Atlanticist vision. I don't know if we will have time to speak about that, but this Atlanticist vision it's much more difficult if you don't have the UK with you.
Well, in fact, I wanted to segue, if I may, to widen the aperture and ask not precisely the Atlantic question, but the much broader foreign policy positioning question. Europe going forward, how does Europe position itself vis-a-vis the United States, vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Russia? What are the elements of a future European post-Brexit foreign policy?
Well, at the core, again, we have to work on our own competitiveness. So that's an internal matter, but we need to look into how we invest in our future in terms of R&D, in sustainability, in digitalization. That's, if we don't do that, we can forget the rest. So I just want to start with that. But more as a global actor, of course, building on that single market success, materializing, it is the trade policy. We will, in all earnest, be a soft power for the foreseeable future. And I think, but in the review we have now going on the trade policy in Europe, we need to step up the game and be more ambitious, and that means that we also have to be in some cases less naive. We see, and a watershed actually is whether we will have 4 more years of Mr. Trump, or if we will in a way go back to Biden, where we could see the US as an ally in all our ambitions globally. And I think what the first important message to send to the US, whoever takes over the White House next year, is that we want to cooperate with you. I think there is a huge risk that the US, with a Trump 2 administration, will go after the Europeans. And that is severely bad news for both us and them if that happens. That will have a ripple effect on maybe also in the hard security concerns, because then Europe will start to think that we cannot rely on these people on the Americans in any case, and we would do a lot of unnecessary spending and investments in fields where I think where they could be put to use in a better way. And not saying that we should not spend more on defense, also representing one defense industry, mind you. So I think that's, and equally, of course, the trade policy review is mostly about how to tackle China. It would be so much easier if we did it together with the US, but it's all about doing the double act of insisting on multilateralism, but also seeking a bilateral relationship with China, where we will put them to stand up for whatever they sign in such as it will be then hopefully an investment agreement, where we can have both offensive and defensive instruments at hand and apply them, not just referring to some loose multilateral or WTO-related sanctions. So I think that's where we should spend our time.
Well, first of all, I think that yes, absolutely, the fourth technological revolution, if we miss this one, we will consolidate a trend that unfortunately is there, is that Europe today is more the chessboard than a chess player. Is the chessboard, and we have seen already in this first Trump administration, and I hope only Trump administration, this just clearly, but when you see the Huawei discussions, you see that unless we bet on our Nokia or on our Ericsson, especially in the areas where we are complementary with the United States, this transatlantic link has to be restored. And unfortunately, the perspective of a second Trump administration doesn't bode well for that. Now, let's look inside. Yes, inside we have to get more competitiveness, but we have to get our ideas. We have to get our ideas together as well. We cannot have 27 positions vis-a-vis China and yet claim that China, European Union. It's one of the highlights before COVID, one of the highlights of the German presidency was going to be this summit with China, where the European Union was going to consolidate its position. But for the moment, what we have is 17 plus 1, Portugal just welcoming, not having any restrictions, or Greece, the Piraeus port, yet other member states like Spain trying to keep certain limits to Chinese expansion. Unless we coordinate, and there, yes, I agree with Magnus, the word is coordinate. Unless we coordinate this approach, we are in a difficult position. And the Huawei debate is just that. Now, on defense, I'm an Atlanticist. I think that NATO is fundamental. But we Europeans, we have to understand that NATO will not go, even with a non-Trump administration, even with the Biden administration, it will not go as it used to be. This is not Trump, this is a tendency. The United States is on a different course, and we need to understand that. And we have not just the Mediterranean, where we see that France and Greece and Italy have a position, and yet with vis-a-vis Turkey, in the bottom end, in the Levant of the Mediterranean vis-a-vis Turkey, and yet Germany takes a very ambivalent position. It's very difficult to speak about Europe in the world, or the European Union in the world, with such differences. We need to put our act together, and it's not going to be a common foreign policy, but at least a coordinated one. At least we cannot have the biggest member state when the second most relevant member states in area of defense, excluded Great Britain because it's Brexit, just takes a position, seconded by Italy, seconded by, of course, by Greece. It's the message that we are sending to the world is terrible. One issue here, and where we Europeans, we need to get our act together in another area, is our narrative. Europe, what for? Because in the end, this is what is crucial. Europe, what for?
This is perhaps a rhetorical question and hence an unfair one. But where does the leadership come from to, as you say, Anna, get your act together? Where does the leadership come from to make Europe more coherent, to have a more coherent, not just narrative, but reality?
Well, frankly, the problem here is that we have a ambivalent, not reluctant, an ambivalent leader, and this is Germany. When Germany leads, and this is the MFF, so the multi-annual budget, and this is the fund for the COVID. When Germany leads, Germany gets things done. And this is the big picture, but it's also true in the internal market, in in legislation. It's also true that, and this is the Germany that just leads within, leads the European Union. Then there are moments where Germany goes its way, and this is immigration, the decision on immigration in 2015, the Syrian crisis, goes its way, and then what happens is that European Union reluctantly follows, and reluctantly means that the project just sputters. And then there are areas where Germany doesn't want to lead, either is absent or doesn't participate. For instance, defense, and where things do not happen. It's as simple as that. This doesn't mean that it's just Berlin. You need Stockholm, you need Paris, you need the other governments. Of course, you need them. But if Germany is not present, you know what, in the end, Germany is a bit the cement of things that happen.
Well, and the complication, of course, is that Germany is going through its own leadership transition. Magnus, how do you see it?
No, I was about to give the more obvious response that it's a French-German commonality that would be required to really make the magic happen. And maybe that is also the response to your reservation about going into a transition period. With Germany, I think the French president will be there to fill the void and the vacuum in that moment. And whether he has Germany with him in doing so or not will, of course, depend on the effectiveness of European policies in the meanwhile. But at the end of the day, Germany must lead from behind. And of course, with their history, they are reluctant at times to lead from the front. But I think, again, I'm optimistic. I think the new commission is better equipped in terms of its personalities to be an effective instrument for Europe being more outspoken. And I think the combination of French ambitions and German structure here could actually do the trick. But again, countries like Sweden and Spain, we would, of course, insist that would not be taken too far, but that how boring as it is, I mean, the working groups in Brussels must do their boring job as well in order to massage it, in order to make sure that there is a sufficient transparency in that French-German cooperation.
Everybody buys in. So, and you have to sell the idea. And this is what is done. And this transactional role of Brussels in general is fundamental.
I want to thank you both, Magnus, especially for using the word boring. I've wanted to be bored for a long time this year, and COVID has made this anything but a boring year. And this has not been a boring conversation. So thank you, Anna. Thank you, Magnus. And let's see what happens next. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the New Thinking for a New World podcast. We welcome your comments, and please subscribe to other episodes in the podcast app of your choice. This podcast was made possible with the generous support